Morning and welcome to the 28th meeting in 2020 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. I hope everybody is well. Now, before we move to take the first item on our agenda this morning, can I inform people that there will be an act of remembrance will take place at the Scottish Parliament this morning. I therefore propose to pause the committee at around 11 o'clock so that we may observe 2 minutes silence. That means, unfortunately, that I may have to interrupt anyone who's actually taking part in any question or answer at that time, and for that I sincerely apologise in advance. That being said, the first item on our agenda today is to take evidence on our pre-budget scrutiny. This is our third panel of stakeholders, and we're interested in the impact of COVID-19 on the public finances, etc. I warmly welcome our witnesses to the meeting and thank you very much for providing us with some written submissions which were very useful. This morning we have Jennifer Wallace, who's the Head of Policy for the Carnegie UK Trust, Ian Finlay, who's the Chief Officer with Pass for All, and Judith Robertson, who's the Chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission. I'm just going to go straight to questions, and if I may start, in your submission, Jennifer Wallace from the Carnegie UK Trust, you talk about putting national well-being at the centre of the 2021-22 budget and the need for a new narrative to be developed. I was interested that you say the key elements of a new narrative include long-term planning and building resistance, rebalancing economic, environmental and social outcomes, and addressing inequalities. But given the current situation and the increasing uncertainty and volatility in the Scottish budget, how would you see this long-term planning working in practice? And what specifically do you mean by the rebalancing of outcomes which you refer to? Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you and to have this opportunity to talk to you about our submission. The work that the Carnegie UK Trust does is informed by understanding of well-being as societal well-being, so well-being that encapsulates social, economic and environmental outcomes. And we have been a partner with the Scottish Government for a number of years on the National Performance Framework and on how to build the National Performance Framework up so that it serves all of us and helps support the developments of our well-being. So it's from that perspective that I'm speaking to you primarily on. And our sense of that journey on 10 years on the National Performance Framework is that the intention is strong, the political will is there, but progress is very slow in terms of shifting public services to delivering on those outcomes. And it's that sort of slow, stilted nature of the change that I think concerns us. I'd say we're not alone in that. Many commentators have addressed issues around 10 years since the Christie Commission, commenting that it has been a very limited shift towards joined up and preventative spend. Now, in many of the conversations, both research and in sort of policy development that we have, it's the budget process that people point to as a stumbling block in terms of shifting to that larger scale vision on national well-being. And I think there are good reasons for that. I think some of it relates to transparency, and we've raised in our submission issues around transparency of the budget, but also that we're still in a situation where the outcomes are considered really after the main bones and structure of the budget rather than before. Now, why we think this is important, particularly now, is because when money will be tight, and we can all anticipate that volatility and the difficulty in public finances over the next few years, that we have to be careful about how we spend that cash. And we don't want to waste the time and the opportunity to spend that in ways that could reduce the demand on public services in the future. So if I give you an example of that, you will, I hope, all be familiar with the care review and the equations, the follow the public pound methodology that was used at the back of that talked about how we can assess the failure demand on public services. Now, in a tight financial settlement, there is, of course, an argument to restrict public services to those most in need. But where we know through evidence that restricting will cause more problems in the long term and more costs in the long term, then our argument would be that this is actually not the time to be restricting that kind of spend. I think I would also just close my comments on this section by saying that from the perspective of the Carnegie UK Trust, we've been on this journey for 10 years, but I've also conducted independent research into the 20-year history of Scotland and its journey in devolution. And the first time that this committee raised concerns about the budget process and the lack of connection between inputs and outcomes was back in 2000. And I reflect on that because there never seems to be a good time to start this journey, whether it's because we have other priorities as a society or because we're still getting to grips with the early days of the Parliament. So while I appreciate this may not feel like the best time, my question back would be, well, when will be a good time? Because time moves on and people are struggling right now. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very helpful opening and general setting of the picture, Jennifer. I'm very grateful for that. Obviously, cash resource, as I think you recognise yourself in your opening question, answer, is going to be tight, to say the least. And given that there are significant new pressures that inevitably will be in the health and care sector, and in economic recovery, I just wonder if you could say a bit more about how we begin to turn some of the words you just used into real practice on as far as the budget's concerned, so that we can get some sense of what that means in practice and in reality for the budget.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to expand. So I think at the moment where we are in the relationship between outcomes and budget is that there are primary and then occasionally secondary outcomes that are sought. In order to maximise the wellbeing impact on the population, we could refocus that and think about actually how does every area of spend maximise its impact on every outcome. Now that I appreciate as a job of work, and I'll come on to how we might do that job of work together, but that would help us think about actually in every policy, how are we building a better environment? In every policy, how are we making this better for children and young people? So if you look, for example, at classic policies on economic or on infrastructure, there are ways of building infrastructure policies that have both social and environmental outcomes built in rather than bolted on at the end. And those are the kind of sort of really thoughtful ways that we would be hoping the Scottish Government was able to move forward, so that obviously it can meet what it needs to achieve in this time, but do it in a way that has the maximum impact across all the different domains of well-being. Within that, in terms of how you actually then do that, it's one of the things that is striking to me is that the policy process of developing and appraising budget proposals is not transparent. So the wealth of knowledge that my sector and the NGO sector or the academic sector might have to bear on policy proposals is not harnessed. And I think at this time, when we're really trying to, as I say, maximise those wellbeing outcomes, we need to make sure that we're using the best evidence that we have from across Scotland on what works as those policies are developed. Now that, I think, can only be done in a spirit of openness and transparency, where we agree that actually we need to get the best and that there will be difficult decisions within that. Not everybody's evidence can be used and not everybody will get the trade-off that they want out of this process. But in a collective process, one that's open and transparent, people will at least have the opportunity to put forward more of their sense of what might make a difference.
Thanks, Jennifer. And lastly, I just wonder if Judith or Ian would like to pick up on any of that theme before I move on to Murdo. Judith, I see you with your hand up. Can I just see the focus as well? Can we use that, the R in the chat bar as well? That would help me understand who wants to come in. Judith.
Yes, thank you very much, and many thanks for the invitation to be here this morning. Just to really, I think, build on what Jennifer has said, from the perspective of the Commission and from a human rights perspective, really what taking a rights-based approach to the budget process implies is pretty much all that Jennifer has said. It implies that the budget is not the beginning of the process. The budget comes after the policy outcomes that we're seeking to achieve have been generated. And what taking a rights-based approach does to that process is enable policymakers to use a very clear framework of rights, an internationally agreed framework that the government, the UK government and the Scottish government through the Scotland Act are signed up to and have obligations in relation to, right across the rights spectrum of civil, political, economic, social, cultural and environmental rights. And so those obligations are very clear. They're set out in international human rights law. They provide a series of standards and principles and ways of operating that do a number of things. Clearly, they provide standards by which, as a nation, we can expect to, or we should be expecting, to build our budget allocations on. But first of all, within that, to build our policy goals and objectives upon. Like Jennifer and the Carnegie Trust, the Scottish Human Rights Commission has also been involved in the National Performance Framework process over many years, and has been heavily involved in trying to establish what indicators, what success would look like in terms of meeting those outcomes that the National Performance Framework lead to. And if you look across the framework, you'll see many, many examples of where what's being talked about are effectively, although not explicitly in the framework, achieving people's rights to a better degree. And so the rights are implicit across the whole of the framework. They're implicit across many objectives of government, and they're implicit and occasionally explicit in some of the kind of key legislative areas or areas of policy that the government has within its gift at the moment. So. And what rights do is, as well as both the ways of functioning, the processes, which would include all of what Jennifer has said, ensuring participation. So, and I would say not just the participation of NGOs and academics and civil society, which is really important and a crucial part of that process, but also the participation of those for whom those policies are directly intended to have an impact. So that would be directly with people with disabilities, directly with people who are on the sharp end of the impact of COVID, people who are working in low-income, low-wage economy in Scotland, of which that's a large section of our workforce. Those people would actually be directly involved in conversations around both the policy goals of the government and then the budget allocation as they're intended. And the other aspect, which I would say, as well as all the kind of different policy areas which human rights impact upon, are the key sort of standards and principles that are, as well as participation, that of transparency. Jennifer has already highlighted it, and I'm really reiterating it because it is a human rights principle, and that the Commission, along with a number of other partners, have done a lot of work to try to analyse the budget process, both at Scottish Government level and as that plays out through public authorities in Scotland, as where most of the money is allocated. That's incredibly difficult to do at the moment. The lines through which you can, as we said, follow the money are almost impossible. And I'm sure, as the committee have found themselves over the years, that's not an easy thing to do. And that can be fixed. That's a very fixable problem, but a really crucial one if we're to actively, in this point of crisis, and I suppose I would argue that actually it's when crisis happens, when a shock to the system happens like this, that you actually have the most opportunity to change, because everything's in flux, and if you're actually wanting, rather than playing safe and holding on to what we know, now is the moment to open it up and say, okay, what we've got so far has got us to here. but we actually need to do something differently in order to do it better in the future. So that narrative around build back better is a really important one, but better needs to really engage with people's rights. I mean, clearly I could talk a lot longer. I'll stop now, and hopefully I can come back to the other points that I've got to make in the course of the meeting.
I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunity, Judith. Ian, do you want to just pick up quickly on that, and we'll go to Murdo after that?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me to join your committee session. Just want to reinforce and support what Jennifer was saying about embedding well-being within the budgetary process more fully. And Convener, you asked the question how that could be done in practical terms. Just two key concepts or principles, which I'll just very briefly outline. One is thinking about preventative spend. So this is going back to the Christie Commission report, which I know is over 10 years now, but I think it still applies. Spending a little now to save a lot later on, which I think is particularly applicable to some of the key challenges which we're facing: climate change, public health, inequalities. And the thing about preventative spend, in some ways there's never a good time to start, as Jennifer was saying, but there's also no time like the present. Because what preventative spend will do, it will start tackling the cause of some of these big challenges we have, rather than the endless treating and more unsustainable treating of the symptoms. So that's one concept, the preventative spend. And the other is, I think, applying more of a systems approach to the way in which we deliver policy and the way we design our budgets. I think gone is the day where you think of budgets in isolation. So you have a health budget, a transport budget, an economy budget, a community budget. What a systems approach allows is for a much more integrated approach where you think of policy alignment. And I think health is a very, very good example, because with health, it's not just up to the health budget to deliver health outcomes. Transport, climate change, land use, the planning system, all have a huge part to play in delivering health outcomes. And so we need to think of things more as systems now and joining up policy areas. And I think that applies to the budget as well. So when we're looking at any particular challenge, we don't just look at the principal policy area for that challenge. We look across the whole budget and see how every bit of the budget can, say, contribute to health outcomes and dealing with, say, the COVID-19 epidemic. Now I'll come on hopefully and talk about how investing in physical activity, in particular walking and cycling, can really help with preventive spend, and is a very good example of this sort of systems approach. I'll leave that to later on, hope to get the opportunity to do that.
I'm sure you will again, Ian. There's many members who want to ask a series of questions. So, Murdo, over to you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the witnesses. I just wanted to ask you a question really to follow on from the Convener's line of questioning. And you've all talked about planning for budgets in quite high-level terms. And I wonder if I can try and press you just to be a little bit more practical, because we will be looking at getting a Scottish budget, we think, now in early January. So specifically, what are the changes you would like to see in the budget from where we've been in the past? What are the things you would like to see in this coming budget, more emphasis being put on, whether that's revenue spending or capital spending? And of course, given the issue with budget pressures, what would you like to see less money being spent on in order to make that affordable? Maybe I can start with Ian and then just work our way around.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. So I think my top priority in answering your question is actually very simple. It's something that we can apply to everyone, every day, everywhere. And I think it also represents very good value for money. In fact, what I'm talking about will actually be a net saving, I think, for the Scottish budget in the long term rather than a cost. And that is to invest more in physical activity. In particular, to invest more in infrastructure relating to recreational walking and in active travel. Active travel, so that's walking, wheeling and cycling for everyday short journeys. Now, I know we're already investing a lot in that, and that is extremely welcome. What I think I'm talking about is an increase in pace and scale. which will require upfront investment. But I do firmly believe, and the evidence shows that long term, going back to my preventative spend point, this will actually save money. So where's that money going to come from? That money can, what I'm talking about, I think, is not so much an increase in the size of the budget, but it's more a reallocation process. And that is where I go back to my second point on systems change. So, for example, in the health budget quite rightly is predominantly on primary care, and it has to be, and that is very, very important. We have a fantastic health service, and it's good that we put resources into that. But in the fullness of time, I would like to see a reallocation of funding from primary care into prevention. So just to be a bit glib in some ways, to invest more in a well-being promoting health service rather than an illness fixing health service, which goes back to my preventative spend point. So I'm not really talking about additional funding here, I'm talking about reallocation of funding. And then reallocation also from different parts of the budget. And I'll go back to the original point I made and think of health outcomes. The transport budgets can really support health outcomes. And a very good example at the moment is Spaces for People, where that is a road reallocation initiative to promote walking and cycling, to promote public health, that's actually funded through transport. So I think I'm talking about reallocation not just within one budget head, but across the budget. And just to finish, I think this is of really direct relevance to COVID-19, because there's now very good evidence that being physically active immediately and significantly enhances the immune system. So if we want to prepare the population to be as resistant as possible to COVID-19, future pandemics, bugs in general, one of the best things we could do is invest in physical activity. And the difference in the immune system is greatest with people who are either inactive or suffer from long-term health conditions, which are also those who are most susceptible to COVID-19. So investing in physical activity, a little bit more investment in physical activity and infrastructure for recreational walking and active travel, I believe is one of the best ways in which we can tackle the COVID-19 crisis, but also promote public health, promote equalities, reduce inequalities, and also help tackle the climate emergency.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. And maybe I could ask Judith the same question.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. For me, what I would be looking to see change is an explicit articulation that we have taken people's rights into consideration in making the allocations that we're making. So, for example, in our submission, we outline a series of what we call normative questions. The language isn't great, but anyway, big questions that actually begin to answer or begin to probe as to whether or not we're actually taking people's rights into consideration. And so are we looking at the needs of people who are most vulnerable first? And are we then adequately addressing those needs? So if you can look across the budget and see no expression of whether or not we've even asked that question, then you can say that it's not meeting the standard that we would be expecting internationally to say, yeah, we're really taking people's rights into consideration. I'll give you a specific example. For example, if we look at the allocations in relation to the social security budget. Now, the social security budget is a significant budget. I think it's the second biggest across the Scottish Government. It reaches far into the lives of the poorest people in this country. In that budget, if that allocation, for example, is dropping, this would just be an indication, then you would be really looking to interrogate that from a budget perspective to say, that's a regressive step. And so why are we taking a regressive step in those spheres? These are some of the most vulnerable people in our communities, and that's a real indicator. For example, I'm not saying that's going to happen or that would happen, but it would be an indicator that policy was being made on a basis which was not meeting our obligations in relation to our human rights obligations. And so, looking across the budget, there are both, I think, strategic ways of looking at it, and then sort of across the budget and then down each budget line of saying, is the overall allocation actually progressing people's rights. Even in a time of constrained budgets, in fact, even more in a time of constrained budgets, we'd be looking to see effectively who's winning and who's losing out of this budget allocation. Are some of the most disadvantaged groups losing more than some groups that you might consider to be better off? Are our allocations meeting the minimum needs that people in our society need to thrive? And so the specific instances that Ian is talking about in relation to physical activity, for example, that's a good example. It's meeting potentially lots of budgetary or policy goals in relation to reducing our carbon emissions, increasing the health of the population. But even within that expenditure, as an example, who's going to win most? Where would that money be allocated? Would it be allocated into poor communities? Does the Scottish budget even discern that? Or would it be allocated into relatively prosperous communities where actually the need for that kind of expenditure might be more limited? So there's lots of questions. I suppose what from my perspective, what I would see change is that the answers to those questions were explicit, that we knew we were asking those questions, which were outlined in detail in our submission, and B, that we can actually follow the money to know how these questions are being answered. That would be a huge shift. I suppose what I would continue to reiterate is upstream of that, is that the policy goals that we're seeking to achieve are explicit, and that the committee and the Parliament is able to track the policy goal and the budget allocation and say, yeah, that makes sense. That actually makes sense. And at a level, not just the Parliament and the committee, but people in Scotland can see that for themselves. That is explicit to people that, oh yeah, okay, this is what we're trying to achieve, we agree with that, or we don't agree with that, but at least if we don't agree with it, we can see where the money is being allocated and who's benefiting from that. So there's a lot in that, clearly, both process and goals are key parts of how we would hope to see the budget change.
Okay, thank you. And Jennifer, please.
Thank you. So I agree with the points that the previous witnesses have made. I'm sure committee, like me, will be receiving reports every single day about the evidence of the impact of COVID-19 on our people and on our places. And I think as that evidence accrues, we can see that there are perhaps two very clear areas of activity. One is the long tail of the mental health issues that will arise from this. Now, we should say we already had significant issues with anxiety, loneliness and isolation in our society even before COVID, and that has been massively exacerbated because of the situation. To stress that actually it is often our young people who are in the worst situation there, and perhaps I need to think particularly about those situations a little bit more. The other area, again, no surprise at all, is around the impact on employment, and I'm going to extend that to employment and meaningful activity, because the issue is really one of well-being, not just about income, though having a secure income matters massively for your own individual well-being, but also the ability to engage with others and to pursue something that you see as meaningful. And that may be, voluntary work or community work. It may not be in paid employment. So what we would hope to see is that there would be initiatives particularly focused on supporting those groups, as Judith says, the people who are most likely to be at the hard end of that, both in terms of equality groups, but also in terms of our communities. And if I can just go back to the budget process around those issues, I think it is worth reinforcing what Ian was saying, that the benefits of investing here will accrue to the health budget, but the costs don't necessarily fall in the health budget. So one of the ways that we think is interesting is looking at and I see there's 1 minute to 11, so I will maybe just make this point and then maybe come back to it. There have been really interesting developments in New Zealand around how we can think about budgeting for outcomes, joint pooling, joint accountability, and I think those are things that particularly in this phase the Scottish Government should be looking at.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was very helpful timing. When we conclude the 2-minute silence, we'll come back and get a question from John Mason. So we will now commence with the 2-minute silence as an act of remembrance, and all of our screens will be continue to operate. And so can we just stay in situ, please? Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, colleagues, for observing that act of remembrance. And as I said, just before we went into the 2-minute silence, we'll commence again now with John Mason. John, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Convener. If I could ask each witness one question, although the others may want to come in as well. And firstly with Judith Robertson. I mean, I was interested in your thoughts, and it's box 1 in your presentation about possible tax increases. I personally am sympathetic to that, but we do hear quite strong arguments that this is not a time to be raising tax, and that businesses are struggling and they should actually get a tax break rather than a tax increase. Could you say something about your thinking about tax increases?
I'm waiting for my come off mute. That's free. I mean, basically, obviously, in terms of budgetary measures, we have to both raise income in order to spend it. So that recognition, that taxation, is a very important part of the budget process, and raising resources and looking at the different ways that the government can do that is as much part of the budget process as the expenditure. So that's the sort of basic, that won't become as news to anybody on the Finance Committee. And so, I mean, you're right, these are difficult times. However, even within those times, we really need to look at the tax take of government. Clearly, we recognise as a Commission that the tax powers of the Scottish Government are limited, and so the levers that they have are also limited. But even within that, we would be saying that, and when I say we, I'm saying that because international human rights law obliges the government to do this, to really look at the maximum available resources they can generate in order to ensure people's rights are realised to the maximum they can be. And so the process of doing that involves looking at taxation. It also involves looking at how we deal with fraud and tax avoidance processes most effectively. Now, that is much less within the gift of the Scottish Government. But actually, if you look at it in terms of the income that can be generated around that kind of process, it's potentially massive. However, back to your question specifically on taxation. I mean, we're not tax experts, and I wouldn't make any claim on that. There are others you will talk to will know far more from that perspective of how to generate increased revenue through the tax process. Our interest is in seeing, from a human rights perspective, that is a key policy goal, should be a key policy goal of government in order to better fulfil people's rights at this time. I also
sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, could you? I know you're not tax experts, but could you specifically say, do you think there's room for? Is it people who have got good incomes we could tax more, or is it more wealth and property?
I would say you'd have to look across the spectrum and really look at all of these areas, whether it be in relation to land tax, whether it be in relation to regenerating council tax. I mean, there's various propositions that have been put in the evidence that you've received around improving the tax take. All of these things need to be looked at. From a Commission perspective, again, I would ask those same questions about who's winning and who's losing in relation to that tax take. Where is the money coming from? Is it coming from people with wealth? Will that generate enough? Again, if you look at where money lies in this country, we're not a high-income population, and so there needs to be a really good examination, and across those different spheres, to see where is the most appropriate place for that tax to be brought, but also to look at, for example, thinking this morning about the decision to increase to accept the living wage of £9.50 an hour. If all our low earners in this country received the living wage, that would put them into a tax paying, if they were working full time, that would put them into paying tax. Now, currently we have nearly half of our working age population is not contributing to the tax take of the economy. That could be a significant improvement in both, not just the incomes of people in their homes, but the tax take of the government. So there are,
That's great. Thanks very much. That's great. Thanks. If I could move on now to Jennifer Wallace. I mean, maybe on the same theme. I don't know if you want to mention tax, but I note in particular in your paper, you talk about long-term planning, building in resilience, and then addressing inequalities and things like that. But when you say building in resilience, it seems to me that one of the ways of doing that is by having savings. I mean, individuals are showing signs of saving money rather than spending it. And I suppose my question is then, should government also be trying to save money at this time, despite the fact people would say there should be more expenditure? So can you say anything around that area of resilience to Jennifer Wallace?
Thank you. So if I probably make a prior comment on the basis of the question about taxation. Now, the Carnegie UK Trust doesn't have a position on taxation per se, similar to the other organisations here, but Wellbeing does ask us to think about intergenerational fairness and the well-being of future generations within that. And I think it is incumbent on us to be thinking about how we can make sure that we pay for the services today and what we need today without placing too high a burden on the generations to come. Many people in the wellbeing field point to wealth taxation as a way of addressing some of those issues. In terms of the specific point about resilience, I mean, we're despite the way that we sometimes talk about it in the media, the government's finances are not like household finances, But I think that one of the ways that we are talking about building resilience into public finances is about that upstream spending and learning how to spend to save. Now, our systems just don't support us in this. We have no way of matching the cost and benefit economically with cost and benefit environmentally and socially. There are examples in other jurisdictions of them trying to do that kind of work. And those are the things that we think that we should really be learning from. So, in a system where we really want to understand what we can do in the long term, we have to find better ways of accounting for all of those outcomes in the long term so that we can start processing and making better decisions here and now. So I wouldn't want to comment particularly on the, sort of borrowing powers or whether there should be anything held in reserves. I mean, that's up to others who are more expert in it. But I do think that we need to reorientate how we think about public finances to understand that some of the things that we think of as social services or public services can actually be thought of as capital investments and perhaps be accounted for in a different way to help us focus on that future. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And then if I could come to Ian Findlay, and particularly, I mean, you've mentioned preventative spend, and I find that it's a very, very interesting area, and this committee has, over a number of years, looked at that subject. I mean, is it not the case that if we want to put more into primary or preventative spend, we really need to close a hospital or something like that? I mean, there needs to be decisive short-term action, cutting some kind of service in order to free money up for other things. Is that not the reality?
Thank you for the question. Can I just quickly touch on the taxation question and just mention another key principle, and that's the polluter pays principle, which I think is particularly relevant when we come to think of transport. If we want to deliver climate change inequalities and public health outcomes, I do believe, as we put in our evidence, we need to shift from using the private car less to using public transport for longer journeys and walking, cycling and wheeling for short everyday journeys. And we all have to make that choice. And all I would say is that probably fiscal levers, I know some of those will reside with Westminster, but there may be some with Scottish Government. There may be fiscal levers that can help bring about that transition where we, all of us here, choose not to use the private car, but to use public transport and active travel as a means of travelling about. Yes, so on your question on preventative spend, and that I think is the key challenge, is where is the money going to come from? And I think a very simplistic solution is, yes, we'll take money from hospitals, GPs, and we'll put it into interventions that promote health and well-being. But I think it is more complex than that. I would be the last one to be advocating that we close a hospital here or close a health centre. I think we need to look at this carefully, look at the unintended consequences. But I think the general principle of where there are genuine savings within the health budget and other budgets, then a top priority for that saving should be investing in preventative spend. So going back to our original point, what we do is we decrease long-term the burden on primary care. Because I do believe it is unsustainable. If we're always in the mode of fixing people once they're ill, that is an endless cycle, an unsustainable cycle, and probably a more costly cycle as time goes on. We need to find a way of breaking out of that and trying to keep people as well as possible for as long as possible. And I do think physical activity has an absolute key role to play in that. So I don't think we should cut hospital budgets and put this into well-being physical activity budgets. But I do think there needs to be, wherever possible, back to just transition and these sorts of concepts. We should be moving funds as they become available. The top priority for any spare funds should be preventative spend.
Okay, thanks, Convener. I look forward to seeing the spare funds that we've got.
Yeah, John, I think you raised some interesting points, but I'm still struggling personally to see where the practical examples are of where that change could be made. Quite rightly, we heard from one of the witnesses saying that in terms of mental health, we've got a real challenge that will probably require additional expenditure, which is a reactive process rather than as a result of the COVID pandemic, rather than necessarily being something that's preventative at this stage. So that just actually means more money going into to be a reactive. So it's going to be a real challenge. Anyway, and that being said, if we could try to get as much of the practical examples into the rest of the discussions. I think that would help us. So it's some very good high-level discussion. But Patrick, would you like to take over from there, please?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to our witnesses. Yeah, I mean, I would like to take some of these arguments like well-being, putting climate at the heart of the budget, and really explore to what extent the government is doing it. Because all the witnesses have made arguments along these lines. I'm looking at the Carnegie submission about placing well-being at the centre of the next budget, and right next to it on the screen I've got a press release from just before the Parliament debated the last budget, where the government is saying we've put well-being at the centre of our budget. And at both the stage 1 and 3 debates, Kate Forbes made that case in the chamber as well. Was well-being at the centre of the last budget? And if I could come to Jennifer Wallace first of all, can you pick out what was different about the last budget compared with, if that agenda hadn't been adopted? Was it actually delivered? Does the government have a clear sense of what putting well-being at the heart of a budget actually means in practice?
Did you want that to go to?
If I could come to Jennifer Wallace first of all.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just waiting to be unmuted there before I started. So I think we have to recognise that the Scottish Government is in a transition towards a wellbeing budget and towards a whole wellbeing approach. If I look back at previous budgets, there was so for a while, perhaps the NPF, the National Performance Framework, wasn't really mentioned at all, and then there was a while where I suppose I would describe it as a top and tail approach, where it appeared, as the bookends, of the discussion, but not necessarily woven through it. We've definitely made headway on that, and you can see, and that's when I talked earlier about primary and secondary outcomes, the attempt for people when they are putting forward propositions for the budget and when those are being discussed to identify more than one outcome, so more than health, more than education, more than housing, and start trying to think of that in a well-being way. Now, my view on where to go next is I find slightly hard to answer because we don't have that transparency on the process of what goes into that thinking. So I haven't seen a pre-expenditure assessment, so I don't know whether they assess against all of the outcomes or how they assess it. I don't know whether it's ex ante or ex post, for example, and that makes it very hard for me to answer the question honestly about whether or not this is a fully well-being budget. So I would first want to see that transparency. What I think is clear is if you were to do a full well-being budget, that complexity is beyond the ability of any government to do in 1 year. So what you need to do is develop a plan for how you're going to do it over a period of time, say 5 years or 10 years, in order to move to an outcomes-based or a well-being approach in the budget. And that's where I think we can see them iterating, but my preference would be to see it in that much longer term plan. How are we going to get from, sort of this kind of 1 or maybe 2 outcomes to understanding it in the round? One of our suggestions for that is to look at a life stage approach. So rather than identifying a handful of issues, and this is perhaps the way that they went following New Zealand in the last budget, issues which they know are of concern to well-being, to therefore, sort of double down on investment in them, to take a population group that we know is not being well served. So at the moment, if you look at the National Performance Indicators, our indicators for children and young people are certainly not improving, and in many cases are getting worse. So our suggestion, our proposition is that if we take that section of the population, what would we have to do to create a wellbeing budget for children, and particularly for our youngest children? Now, we're very lucky to be working with Children in Scotland on that. We're working with Catanach, another independent foundation, and the intellectual weight behind that is being delivered by Catherine Trebeck, and we hope to be able to provide sort of a work in progress, initial thoughts on that before the end of the year for people to start to engage with. This is a very new process. These are all innovations. Nowhere in the world has got this right yet, even though New Zealand is heralded as having a wellbeing budget. The people within New Zealand would say themselves that was only the first step on the journey. And I go back to points I made earlier. We need to intentionally make that first step on the journey if we're going to get there in the next 5 or 10 years, and that's what I would hope to see. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, as someone who is very sympathetic and enthusiastic about the idea of moving to well-being indicators instead of narrow metrics like GDP, but also sceptical that the government is fully thinking it through yet, this seems like a much more honest representation of things than for a Cabinet Secretary to stand up in the Parliament and say, this is a well-being budget. It seems that was premature as a description of the last budget. And even your own suggestion that what we need is a national conversation about well-being kind of suggests that we don't yet know how to make this next budget a well-being budget. So, would you agree that the Scottish Government shouldn't try to present it in those simplistic terms, that this is a well-being budget, but recognise that there's a way to go in moving away from the contradictions with unsustainable metrics like everlasting GDP growth?
I think it's important to recognise that there is no agreed definition of what a wellbeing budget actually is. So they are as entitled to call their budget a wellbeing budget as New Zealand is. If you're asking me what I think would be in a fully wellbeing budget, then yes, I think they could go further for it to be something that really encapsulates the vision and the opportunity in the National Performance Framework.
Thank you. And finally, can I ask both of the other two witnesses, Ian Finlay and Judith Robertson, both of your written submissions place some emphasis on climate, quite rightly in my view. But don't we need to recognise that as well as the desire to spend a bit more on things like active travel, we need to recognise that we are currently spending very, very large amounts of money on pouring concrete into a road building programme. We're still spending far more money making this problem worse than we are on making it better. Don't there need to be some fundamental re-evaluations going on within the Scottish Government? They produce this next budget about the things that they had already committed to, which are heading in the wrong direction on climate. If I could come to Ian Finlay first of all, and then Judith.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think it links back to being practical as well. So I was going to mention road building. If you want a practical example of how you can combine the preventative spend and systems change concepts I was talking about, is we could reallocate money from road building, which would have a huge positive impact on climate qualities and health and public health, and allocate that into measures which will promote health and well-being. So there is quite an obvious way in which we can reallocate budgets, and it's not allocating from transport through to health. But when you look at the transport strategy, one of the 4 main outcomes of this transport strategy is to promote health and well-being. So I think it's entirely consistent with the transport strategy to start reallocating resources from road building into wider public health measures. So I think, and my take on the budget in general, and whether it's a well-being budget or not, is I think we're moving in the right direction. I really do think with things like the National Performance Framework and the greater emphasis on well-being, I'm really confident, having been in this policy area for 25 years, that we are making good progress. I think the scale and depth of that progress needs to change. So I wouldn't be confident in saying it is a well-being budget, but it's definitely a budget that is moving in that direction. A practical example, I think, is the active travel budget. 5 years ago, the travel budget was for £40 million. It's now up to £80 million. And in the recent programme for government, there's now a commitment for a baseline of £500 million over the next 5 years. So if you want practical examples of where I think we are moving in the right direction in terms of health and well-being and climate change, I think that the increased size of the active travel budget and the long-term commitment over 5 years is a really helpful sign. Another practical example then would be if well-being is to be core to the budget, and I do think the budget is absolutely central. I mean, there is a saying that an organisation or a nation's vision is not found in its strategy, it's found in its budget. So, I mean, the budget is absolutely crucial. If we have a vision of a well-being budget, is how do we get to that point? And I think just like we have equalities impact assessments, why don't we also have well-being impact assessments? And we test the budget, not just at the Scottish level, but local authority level, organisation level. We actually test our budgets to see how they are responding to these wider aspirations of a well-being economy and a well-being society. So planning applications, for example, or development plans, they could have a well-being impact assessment attached to them. And it may be an organisation like Public Health Scotland might be the organisation, can't speak on their behalf, but could be an obvious organisation to bring about that impact assessment process. So I think we're on a positive journey. That's my take. I'm an optimist, but I do think we are on a positive journey. But we need to accelerate that and have more depth to the well-being dimension of the budget.
Thank you very much, and I recognise how much hard work optimism is these days, and particularly this kind of breakneck, rapid process that we have for budget scrutiny makes it all the more challenging to have that kind of analysis. I wonder if Judith Robertson wants to respond to these issues as well.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick, for that. I mean, basically, I agree with your premise that if we look across the budget and look at areas of spend, particularly in infrastructure projects, which we would potentially look at and say, are they really meeting the objectives of the National Performance Framework? Is that spend going to make progressive realisation of people's rights? Is that spend going to further our objectives in relation to meeting our climate targets? Then we have to do that. These are the questions we need to ask. Is that spend helping us meet our outcomes, or is it taking us further away from them? And so I think the allocation in relation to it, I think infrastructure is one of these key areas which has the potential to achieve transformative change. That I genuinely think that. So some of the evidence you've received is around support for housing, affordable housing, the development of affordable housing, and I would add to that, if it isn't already in the submission, housing which meets environmental standards to the point where people's, the cost of energy, the use of those houses is as low as it can be. And so if we're making choices in budget allocations between supporting a high level of carbon use in our expenditure versus one that reduces it, for me, that really isn't a choice. We should be focusing our resources on those processes which reduce our carbon footprint. Now, I mean, I'm far from being the expert in how to do that best. There are many organisations in Scotland for whom that dialogue and debate is very live and very pertinent. But those are the kind of questions, and this is why our input into this process is high level, because while we see what happens across the budget, and I would commend the equality statement that is attached to the budget as another way of interrogating what are we doing here? How far are we advancing, whether we call it a well-being agenda, a human rights agenda, how far are we advancing? Does that statement feel robust? Does it actually address the key areas where disadvantaged people who are not thriving in our community are being best supported? Our Black and minority ethnic community, how are we realising their rights in this setting? Do we have an analysis of how people's rights are being affected at the moment? And can we see a path out of that? And is that reflected in the budget? But the biggest barrier, I would say, at the moment to anybody doing that, whether it be the Commission, the Parliament, the committee, or any interest group, is the lack of transparency in the process. Because we cannot see how the money plays out fully enough to actually provide answers to these questions. We have tried to do that. I saw the Poverty Commission tried to do that in relation to social security, and the narrative, and I'm sure Jennifer would say something similar in her project, actually being able to follow the money to the point of reaching people and how that impacts on individuals. You can make a top-line assessment of that. You can, just by saying, if we're spending it on roads, we're not spending it somewhere else, we're not spending it on active travel, then you can make that top-line assessment, but if you dig down deeper into, well, what is the impact of that? Because arguably you could say, yes, but roads enhance our economic progress, they enable people and businesses to travel effectively and reduce timescales, etc., etc. So you can argue there is a positive economic gain which offsets the negative carbon impact of that. There's lots of discussion to be had. That's a real discussion. Those are real conversations that need to be had, and play-offs and trade-offs that need to be explicit and out there in the public domain. But at the moment, I think that's the process that, from a Commission perspective, we're also saying it's not just the actual decisions, it's the process by which those decisions are made, and the transparency around being able to, as I say, follow the money through the system. I think there is increasing understanding of the importance of the budget amongst civil society in Scotland, and we're going to see increased demands around the kind of things we're saying, because people really are trying to do that. They're trying to follow the money. I have to say, women's organisations have been doing that for years. As a founder member way back in time of the Scottish Women's Budget Group, where we've been really trying to say, well, how have women been impacted by this budget? I mean, it's really decades, and I'd say we should have gone further than this.
I think you made your point quite strongly. You made that point previously as well. Patrick, was that you then left in your questions? Jennifer.
Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for those answers.
Yeah, I think Jennifer also wanted to put in a bit more in that area, if I've got that right. Jennifer, can you make it a bit tighter, please? Because we've now been at this an hour and we've still got quite a number of questions to get from members.
Yeah. Of course, no, I'll be very quick. So just a factual point to back up what Judith was saying there. On our Children's Wellbeing Budgeting Project, we have not yet been able to ascertain how much money is spent on the early years of a children's life in Scotland, which makes it very hard for us to interrogate in terms of the evidence about where you would then want to spend that money. I also think, just as an aside, that, it's very easy for us to make the jump when we're talking about economic activity, so infrastructure proposals make a jump into jobs. It is harder for us to make a jump on social projects and equate that to benefits in the employment of people delivering those services. Now, of course, that's because those are often public sector jobs rather than private sector jobs. From a wellbeing perspective, they're jobs and they're delivering outcomes for people. So we wouldn't see necessarily that you should treat those things as separate as they are sometimes considered. That was my point. Sorry, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're going to Dean Lockhart, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I would like to come back to the question of wellbeing and what it means in practice, because we've had a similar discussion around the definition of inclusive growth in recent years, which is a central part of the Scottish Government's economic strategy. And because that's quite a subjective concept, the definition of inclusive growth has changed a few times, and it's still subject to some interpretation. So I think I've got two questions for the panel. First of all, how close are we to a widely recognised definition of well-being that can be embedded in the National Performance Framework and something that we can measure against budget outcomes? And secondly, in the most recent index of social and economic well-being published in January this year before the COVID pandemic, Scotland's ranking fell from 16th place to 21st place in a ranking of nations for well-being. Is that decline something the panel recognises? And if so, what recommendations in the budget would you make to address that relative decline in well-being rankings? And perhaps I could start with Jennifer Wallace on those two questions.
Thank you. So we have questioned the shifting narratives and language used around this field. So we talk sometimes about well-being, sometimes about well-being economies, sometimes about sustainable development, and sometimes about inclusive growth, as you mentioned. From our perspective, these things are often really getting to the same issues, but using different words, and those different words can be problematic, particularly when they're picked up by, say, somewhere else in the system, like local government officers trying to work out exactly what is the priority and what should they be paying attention to. From our perspective, the statutory national outcomes are about well-being. So while they don't say the word well-being, that's how we would understand them. And internationally, that sense of the connection between your social, environmental, and economic outcomes and well-being, that's pretty much solid, the definition. And this work goes back to the Stiglitz-Fitoussi report in 2009. So there are well-known ways of understanding this, and the OECD leads on that, and they're about to announce a new centre leading on that as well. Inclusive growth for me, I think is slightly different because it doesn't have as strong an environmental or a future lens. So I think it's part of the story of well-being, but it's not the whole story. And I think it is interesting that it has been more easily absorbed within concepts around economic regeneration than well-being, which then has that added complexity within it. So I think there are reasons why some words and some phrasing works for one audience and not another. But my preference would be that we actually have that much stronger sense of the national outcomes as what we are striving for the well-being of Scotland. In terms of the specific index, I didn't catch the reference to which index it was. There are a number of them. Can you identify?
Yeah. It was the Scotland Trends Index published in January this year. I think the title is Index of Social and Economic Wellbeing.
Okay, I would need to go back and check. I don't want to mislead the committee. There are a number of international indexes. Many of them struggle with regional data, so I wouldn't want to get too far into a conversation if actually it turns out to be an issue about the regional data and the comparisons between different areas. But I can come back with a written response on that if that's helpful.
That would be very helpful. And perhaps I could address both of those questions to Judith Robertson and then Ian Finlay. Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose the only thing I would add to what Jennifer has said is about making rights explicit in that process. That actually one of the key aspects of a rights framework, which we haven't talked about today particularly, is that of accountability, is that of being able to measure progress and measure change. And we've been working around the National Performance Framework to really look at proper indices, proper measures in order to know that progress is happening, to report against it, and so that Parliament can see progress is being made. The only other thing I would add around indices is I think they're very useful, they can be useful, but the other big index I would say we should be developing more is that of people's views themselves. So well-being is a very subjective term. Well-being is different for different people, although in previous iterations of my career, when we generated the Humankind Index, it was very clear that the key top-level things that drove people's well-being were their housing, their health, their education, and access to education. And those were the three top things. Interestingly, for me, the economy wasn't top, although people very much saw that economic security drove those other aspects. So they drove their access to health and access to decent housing. And so I think we could do something much more participatory in Scotland to develop an index of wellbeing which is actually based on people's own views, potentially, rather than the sort of broad indicators, or add that to the panoply of something that we do routinely.
Thanks very much. And Ian Finlay to wrap up my questions. Thank you.
Okay, on the definition of well-being, I agree with Jennifer that we should look to National Performance Framework as for the overall definition of well-being. But in the physical activity sector, we use the World Health Organization definition of whole health. And that has 3 dimensions. So it has a physical health dimension, which is the one we tend to focus on most, a mental health dimension, which is becoming more and more important, and a social health dimension. And that World Health Organization definition has been in place now since 1949 and hasn't been better. So I think that is a very good definition of whole health. It has that physical, mental and social health dimension to it. Also, like Jennifer, I'm not familiar with the index that you mentioned, so I'd want to have a look at that. All indices are made up of a whole number of metrics that come together to produce the overall index or the score, and I'd be very interested to see which metrics are responsible for Scotland's decrease in its overall score. Because my take is, I think, in many ways we're doing well, and we're doing well in terms of well-being, and there is investment in health and well-being, but there will be other areas where we're maybe not doing quite so well. And I suspect that will be the metrics that will be in this index. But like Jennifer, I'd like to have a look at that and come back to the committee on that one.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Convener, that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Angela Constance, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. I have one question for each member of the panel, so conscious of time, I'm sure we'll endeavour to talk through this. Can I start by asking Judith Robertson, given her focus on the importance of transparency, given that the fiscal framework is a crucial building block to the budget, how are we going to get better fiscal transparency and understanding with the fiscal framework?
A good question. I think looking at Audit Scotland and the analysis of these things, one of the things they actually are recommending is simplicity and really bringing out the different dynamics that are at stake for people. So this is, as you might imagine, quite far from my area of expertise in terms of actually unpacking the fiscal framework. Although the work we've been doing in the Commission has very much it really is, for me, it really is the job of government to make these things understandable to people and so that people can actually access and understand those processes. So I don't have specific answers for you, to be honest, Angela, in terms of key details at the moment. I can go back and see if we've made some recommendations in relation to some of these key areas. But that task of making it comprehensible, as simple as it can be, and that's a challenge, I think is key to that transparency objective.
Thank you, Judith. I'm not sure anybody has specific answers, but can I move on and ask Jennifer Wallace, who in the Carnegie Trust submission proposed a decluttering of public sector accountability and performance management. So I would be grateful if Jennifer could explain why decluttering is a help, not a hindrance, and can it be done without sacrificing transparency and accountability?
Great, thank you. So yes, my short answer is yes, it can be done. The two things go together for the very reason that Judith mentioned about simplicity, that openness and transparency is aided by simplicity, and the multiple metrics and frameworks that we use across the public sector can actually make it quite difficult to get a grasp on what's actually happening. So in terms of where we start on this, I think it's probably worth just reflecting that there is no hierarchy of with legislation in Scotland. So when the national outcomes were put in legislation in the Community Empowerment Act, they didn't override or take precedence over any of the other things that government asks public services to do. So we have a range of plans, whether that's for local authority plans or whether they're health board plans. We have target systems, particularly in the health service, all of which is layered together with no sense of a hierarchy or how one thing feeds into the other. And that's really what we're talking about decluttering. So if we are measuring a range of activities in performance management, for example, in education or in health, are we measuring them because they connect to the National Performance Framework and the national outcomes, or are we measuring them for a different reason? And do we still need to keep measuring those things given that we are trying to move to outcomes? Because what happens when you're shifting a culture towards outcomes is that the main culture that is still in place, the status quo culture of inputs and processes and output measurement, will always take priority over the new culture coming in on outcomes. So you have to create some space for it. So if you look, for example, at the way that things are reported in the press, that the national outcomes don't get much space and the indicators under them don't get much space because there are a competing set of other things that we talk about in relation to how our public services are being provided and the extent to which those are provided in quality. And we think all of that could be tightened up in a way that actually aids transparency and aids public understanding.
Thank you. And my final question, Convener, is to Ian Finlay. Ian, you articulated this morning about how you want the Scottish Government to set out its plans for economic recovery, putting well-being and the climate emergency very much at the heart of that. So what are both the opportunities and constraints of devolution in doing this? And are there any trade-offs that we need to be aware of?
Well, I am a believer in local democracy. So I think devolution as a concept is good, and so I think devolution can definitely help because it does mean that the people of Scotland can have a greater say in the way in which our society develops and our structures and processes. So I think, devolution as a general concept, and I would take it further, even devolution within Scotland and giving, greater powers to communities. The bottom-up approach is a very healthy way for a society to develop. So I think overall, it is an opportunity, devolution. If you're talking about devolution, within the United Kingdom, then obviously there are some constraints as well, because some powers are devolved and some aren't. So that makes life more complex, but it doesn't make life necessarily more difficult to achieve the outcomes we're all looking for. But there's no doubt that, if in a devolved group of countries like we have in the United Kingdom, there is the need for conversations at that sort of UK-wide level to make sure that we are seizing on the opportunities, the big opportunities of devolution, and minimising the risks and the difficulties of living within a devolved institutions. But I think overall, on balance, I would definitely say it's an opportunity, and devolution is an opportunity to understand the culture, as we're talking about just there, the culture of the different countries, and reflect that, and for the governments that are in power to reflect that and act on the wishes of its citizens.
So specifically in terms of dealing with the climate emergency, and I share your, on balance optimism about life, but in terms of dealing with the climate emergency, do you see any constraints at all with devolution?
With devolution, no. I think you could see a constraint in that Scotland on its own is a small country, and therefore, and climate change is a global issue, and so therefore, what difference can a small country make in a big global sphere? But So that could be seen by some as a constraint, and that we are constrained how much we can do. But I do believe leadership is even more important than what we can actually deliver in Scotland. And so Scotland is, and I think can continue to show, as we've done for generations, show global leadership in terms of climate change. And I think the fact that there's a devolution settlement can enhance that. I think Scotland can really show its values to the fore and really help lead the world. And we've got a fantastic opportunity coming up next year with COP26 for Scotland to really shine and hold the globe to account and say this is how it has to be in terms of climate change, and be very positive, proactive, use the sort of the Scottish psyche and culture and values to really push all leaders and citizens around the globe to really grasp this really huge issue, probably the biggest issue facing us, of climate change and the associated issue of biodiversity loss. I would put the two of those together, and I would then put public health and inequalities all in the same bag, because if we can fix climate change, then I think we will fix a whole number of the massive challenges. So no, I think overall I would say devolution is an opportunity for Scotland to shine and show leadership over Europe and the whole country and the whole globe.
And very finally, Convener, I agree with Mr. Finlay's assessment of the magnitude of the task ahead of us and the vital importance of leadership. But can I just quickly ask, are there any more powers you would like to see devolved to Scotland to put climate change at the heart of economic recovery?
I'd like to reflect on that and come back with a fuller answer, but off the top of my head, I think there is a lot that could be done in terms of transportation. I think a lot of the fiscal levers reside with Westminster in terms of road taxation and the likes. And I think unless we start tackling those, we'll not make it easy for all of us to choose not to use the private motor car when there's another option of either public transport or walking and cycling. So I think to have more devolved powers around the fiscal levers associated with transportation and big infrastructure projects would be a benefit to Scotland, because then we could, and it's a transition, and I do realise that with moving people from private motor cars to other forms of travel, which I think is going to happen, and it's the pace of change which I think is at debate rather than whether it will or it will not happen. I think we could accelerate that change and have climate change benefits, public health benefits, qualities benefits, if we had more fiscal levers that we could use sensitively, accepting that transport industry is, it's a big industry, there's a lot of jobs, so we do need to think about that, but we could accelerate that inevitable transition, I think, away from the private car, if we had more fiscal levers at Scottish governments. Control.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Angela. Alec Rowley, please.
Thank you, Convener. Is there not a danger that people listening to this discussion this morning would say, well, this is fine, this is a sort of middle class intellectual discussion, meanwhile back in the real world? And let me give a couple of examples to try and put that across. I mean, I'm inundated with families who haven't got suitable housing, aren't able to get large enough housing, councils telling them to widen their areas. I had a man contact me a few weeks ago from Ulstrada. He wanted to renew his bus pass. He's in his 40s. He has multiple health issues, so he gets a bus pass. He went along to the medical centre. They sent him an invoice for £20 and said they wouldn't send the form to the council until he had paid that. When I contacted the medical centre in Anstruther, I said, this guy lives on less than £50 a week. You want £20 for to sign his bus pass, you'll put him into further poverty. They accepted that, but said this was a private transaction. So really, for people on the ground, where they can't see joined up government, they actually can't see joined up services to try and support them, can't get the very basic rights to housing, to food, and we're having this conversation. Is it not us that's got something missing here? There are very basics that aren't getting fixed out there.
Do you want that to go to Alec?
Anybody that wants to pick it up on the panel?
My microphone just got on.
Right, Jennifer.
My microphone's on the line. I think it's...
you crack on. Jennifer, yeah.
Okay, sorry, thank you. Sorry, I was trying to be extra polite there. I think what's really important from my perspective is that the reason that we are not able to address endemic poverty in our society is because some of these structural issues haven't been resolved. So yes, we can talk, and we should talk about making sure that we put money into the pockets of people who are in poverty in ways that give them dignity and respect. We should absolutely be talking about housing. But we can't just keep funneling money into a system that is constructed in such a way that it can't make joins between exactly the constituent that you're talking about in a way that says, one service has to charge so that another service can be delivered. Unless we can start thinking about our public services and the role of government in a holistic and joined up way that is about improving the lives of the people that we're here to serve, we'll never overcome those barriers. So I come back to my own research that says that as you sort of talk to people in the system, you say it's the budget that's the difficulty. It's the fact that we keep in these silo mentalities that's the problem, that we can't move things around in order to deal with the primary root cause, which very often is poverty, that are the real issues that need to be dealt with. So yes, I do appreciate that this is it's high level. It gets a bit kind of technocratic and dry, but if we can't fix it at the budget level, then these issues will keep happening to people on the ground. Thank you.
Anybody else want to pick up? Ian, I know you wanted to contribute.
I think it is an extremely important point, and I have to admit personally, it's one of my biggest dilemmas in all of this. And that you're right, it is people who are relatively well off, with respect, like you and me, who are having these conversations. And if you think of climate change, you think of public health priorities, you think of inequalities, it's actually those who have least that are impacted on what we're talking about. So say climate change. It is the richer people, like you and me, that are contributing most to climate change, but it's not actually us who are going to be impacted first and most. It's actually poorer people. And so I think there is a really important issue of humility here, that in our conversations that we have like this, we have got to, I feel I have to appreciate that I'm in a very privileged position having these conversations in the first place. And the best way in which I can enact that privilege is to find ways, which we've talked about on a number of occasions, is making these processes as transparent and inclusive as possible, so that everyone's part of the conversation. Just a good example, just last week I took part in a conference that was one of the preparation for COP26. And there was 1,200 people at that conference, and it was entirely online. And one of the conclusions that we came to, and I mentioned at the end, is we just successfully had an online conference of the people who will make the decisions regarding climate change. Why don't we make the conference much more online? And so we are not having that impact on other people, and especially the poorer people. And also, if you go online, you can also be more inclusive. More people could take part in the conference. So that was just a practical example for me of how we can include everyone in these conversations. Because I do agree. I think there is a real risk that we have these nice conversations amongst ourselves and don't think hard enough about those that are impacted most by the inequalities in our system. And addressing that is just a key priority. And I think the budget process is a top priority for that, finding ways of making it transparent, using infographics, using just good, basic, plain English to make sure that we do our very best to make sure everyone's informed and involved and engaged as they want to be in these conversations.
Judith, I know you wanted to contribute as well.
I am just waiting for unmute.
You're okay now, I can hear you.
Thank you. I mean, basically, that's what a rights-based approach does. Basically, a human rights-based approach is really looking at the whole process from the perspective of people who are most affected by the decisions being made. So that's the purpose of taking a rights-based approach. What I've been talking about in terms of transparency, accountability and participation, those are the people, and I totally agree, you can argue, and indeed would, no doubt that actually who's got time to engage in these sort of high-level conversations when actually people's housing's at stake. That is absolutely is a lived reality for folk. And the Commission works with other organisations, other third sector organisations, to enable that participation as best as we can. And I think it's a fundamental responsibility of government to enable the voices and the views and the perspectives of the people you're describing, Alex, to be a key part of this discussion. That's why I'm talking about taking a rights-based approach to budgeting, because whose rights are we talking about? We're talking about the rights of people most impacted in this crisis today and tomorrow. So while I agree, those views are not explicit. That is what's fundamental to a rights-based approach, and so that is why the Commission is advocating that is part of this budget discussion.
Could I very briefly, Convener, just come back with another question, which is around the budget, and it's this difficulty of strategically setting the priorities and setting the policies, but the delivery needs to happen. And to what extent you should therefore ring fencing, for example, is a way of describing it, but it's to what extent you should be able to direct budgets and then have those budgets, because you can have all the strategies in the world. I used to be the leader of Fife Council. I think we had a cupboard full of strategies that were all sounded good. I think there's a whole load of strategies within the Scottish Parliament. But if you take the housing as a priority, or whatever the priorities are that you're setting, this tension between national and local government in terms of controlling where the money is actually spent, how would you overcome that problem? And do you support more a sort of ring fencing approach to it, which local government absolutely detests? How would you tackle that problem?
Judith, you want to go first?
Yeah, sorry, I'm struggling with my technology. It takes me ages to put an R in, so it's easier for me and quicker to raise my hand. What I would say is that the participation extends into local government. I completely agree with your analysis, and actually the transparency issue I've described also has a real problem in saying what happens to the money once it gets into whichever public authority the expenditure happens. So whether it be health boards, NHS trusts, local government, Scottish Enterprise, however that money is allocated. So it's hard to see what then happens to it, and who wins and who loses. Absolutely, these are key questions for the budget process. What I would say, though, is that in terms of participation, for me, the answer to this lies in who's involved in that discussion, who's involved in that budget setting process, how much power do they have in that conversation, how much ownership is over that decision making, and how does that then pan out at a local and a domestic level? How much active engagement is there in the different stakeholders in that discussion and that conversation? And I mean, I think this is really challenging. I also think it's a massive culture change. So I don't think what we're saying is simple to deliver. I do think principles of subsidiarity deliver better outcomes, but what I also know is you need clear, transparent measures of performance to tell whether or not that is the case. So if we do, if a decision is made to devolve more effective powers into local government, or to give them more control over budget allocation and tax raising powers in the council tax, for example, we need to be able to track whether that expenditure is meeting any kind of outcomes that government in its local democratic institution can do that. At the moment, that isn't the case, and so that's a really challenging culture change. And the Christie Commission dealt with a lot of that, and 10 years down the line, we're still having the same challenges. So yeah, there is a bit of a massive shift that needs to take place to deliver exactly what you're describing. Local government wants some of these same outcomes. These are not outcomes that people don't want. It's just that I don't think if you looked around local government, you wouldn't see all the national performance frameworks reflected in different degrees and different ways, probably across local government, across communities in Scotland. But actually tracking that and being held account, being transparent, and then being able to held account against those targets, that's really difficult. It's not happening.
Ian, I think, thanks, Jude. I think, Ian, you wanted to contribute as well?
I think you're accurate in describing that there is a tension between national government and local government, but I don't see that as a negative. I think that's a positive. If it's a respectful tension, I think that's healthy, because you're on the one hand, you've got national government with national priorities and local government reflecting local priorities. It's back to the devolution point that we're discussing, and as long as that discussion is constructive and positive, I think tension can be healthy, and coming to decisions within that tension environment, I think, makes best decisions. On ring fencing, I think there's a place for ring fencing. I think ring fencing can be useful. I don't think ring fencing should be imposed. I think it's part of this conversation that I've just mentioned. But I think if national government and local government feel that some form of ring fencing is going to be appropriate to deliver national priorities and at the same time local priorities, then I think it is and has been in the past, but a useful tool in terms of budgeting. So I wouldn't rule out ring fencing, and I think the sort of black and white of no ring fencing or always ring fencing is not appropriate. I think it has its place if both local and national government feel that's appropriate.
I'm not sure you wanted back in, Judith, or not, but Jennifer, I mean.
I can just say, similar to what Judith described, the Carnegie UK Trust supports subsidiarity, and in that ring fencing that cuts across the democratic will of the people within a local area would be something that I think we would certainly not want to advocate without considerable thought. I suppose it depends, for me, my response depends on what you mean by ring fencing, because there's ring fencing at the local authority level. There are also ways of allocating specific funds to deal with emergent issues, and I think one of the things that we would be interested in is separate pool funding for things that can be identified as spend to save projects. So where we know that actually investment now might reduce an impact later on, or indeed remove it completely, then it seems to us sensible that that is dealt with in a different financial mechanism. Now, I wouldn't normally refer to that as ring fencing, but I'm not entirely sure if that's the type of thing that you're talking about. And there was a comment just made earlier about whether mental health funding is reactive or preventative, and of course it's both. It's reactive to the situation that we're in now, where people are experiencing difficulty, but mental health difficulties often relate, they turn into further health problems, they turn into difficulties with employment. If they're not dealt with, there are a number of other sort of knock-on effects that are well known. So it's both, and I think those are the kind of situations that our current budget structures are just not well designed to help us deal with in a consistent collaborative way across Scotland.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Alec. Finally, Alistair Allen, please.
Thank you, Convener. We've been talking, or at times we've been talking anyway, about the implications of COVID and building back better after that, and what that means for a budget. I was interested in some of the points that John Mason was raising for debate about what that means in terms of the tension between long-term thinking and short-term thinking for health. So it just struck me that we could be talking, or we probably will hopefully be talking about in the course of this budget, a mammoth vaccination programme in the country. How do budgets plan for or cope with that eventuality, and how do they become flexible enough to cope with them?
You wanted to go to Alistair?
Sorry, probably one for Ian. Probably one for Jennifer Wallace initially.
Okay, thank you. So I think we've already seen within the year of COVID transfers between budget lines and that flexibility being employed in order to deal with the crisis that we're in. And certainly I would be expecting that to be continuing for a considerable amount of time when that flexibility is required. I don't see any particular, sort of theoretical issues around moving that money, because that, of course, the vaccination programme is preventative. We don't have a choice but to do it because of all of the other costs in society. I think the question is that a cost that is borne purely by savings elsewhere in the health service, or is that a cost that is borne across the whole piece? And those would be the things that I would be wanting to interrogate, so that we can understand better if the money is going to be transferred and pushed into that very important spend area. Is it coming from a space where actually we know that the wellbeing impacts, while they're there, are not as strong? And those are the kind of conversations at the moment we're just not well geared up to have as a society, because it's buried within budget lines.
Like the other area, again related to building back after COVID, that I was interested to hear views from, perhaps this time from the other two, from Mr Finlay and from Ms Robertson, is about working and changes to the way that we work. It's often being said at the moment that people will want to rethink the whole concept of commuting, but that has massive implications for the way that we do business, for the way that we do public transport, and for many other areas. But particularly in rural Scotland, it also raises questions about how that might be achieved in terms of small rural hubs where people might be working part of the week. Again, it's just really a question about how flexible budgets can and should be, thinking ahead for some of those things that will be different after COVID.
I'm happy to take that first if you want. I suppose my response to this is the same response as I would have had throughout, which is that to take a rights-based approach to that whole analysis and understanding really looks at, again, whose needs are we addressing first? And it's the same with the, it's quite interesting, it's the same with the actual delivery of the vaccine programme. Whose needs are we going to address first in that? And who are we going to see win and lose in that process? So I think that's a really key process. I know we're talking about budgets, but it really applies across both the policy process and I've said earlier, and the budgeting. So in relation to your question about the long-term nature of work and how it's conducted, again, I would, from a government perspective, looking at an appropriate policy response in that area. If the government's looking to intervene or looking to have a reaction, then that should be done on a rights basis, looking at, well, on whose behalf are we going to intervene first? And who are we going to prioritise in that conversation? Who are we seeing lose out most in this dynamic? If it's frontline workers who we're seeing A, not being paid enough, and B, having to undertake risky journeys in public transport. This is pre-vaccine, hopefully not post. But then we should be looking at ways in which government can intervene in a way which constructively improves people's rights, whether that be the right to health, the right to housing, the right to transport, which then accesses an adequate standard of living. All these rights are at play in these discussions. And again, like Jennifer is describing, we don't have the processes to look in the round at how we're delivering these at the moment, and we're not actually using rights as a conversation in which to base that. Rights are not difficult conversations. Well, they can get difficult, but actually people very inherently understand them when we really start to engage in them. And so for me, that needs to be the driver of some of those decision-making processes across government, and the budget follows that. The budget would be following and should have the flexibility, absolutely, should have the flexibility to follow where and to respond to these circumstances, both for proactive and reactive purposes.
Ian?
I could just respond to both those questions. So I think it's all about flexibility. Yes, a vaccination programme is going to be expensive and the money is going to need to be found. That's a top priority. So we need a budget that's flexible, and we need a mechanism for prioritisation, because the budget is only, it's a finite size, and if we need more money in one bit, and the budget hasn't grown, and economies of scales have all been looked at, then the money needs to be found from elsewhere. And that's where I think prioritisation is critical, and it's the metrics we use for prioritisation which I think is key. So I think at the moment, we've tended to use a simple metric like gross domestic product. I think we need to move to metrics that respond more to climate change, to public health and well-being, and to inequalities. And I think if we apply those metrics to decide on the priorities for the budget, then we'll end up with a budget that benefits most people. And I think it's the same with the home working. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that we've learned an awful lot in the 7 months of home working, and I doubt the world will go back to the same for those who can home work. But I think we do need to bear in mind that there's an awful lot of people who can't home work and haven't had that privilege, going back to a point I made earlier. So I think again it's making sure we maximise the positives for the top priorities that we have in the budget and minimising any negatives. So thinking of rural areas, and thinking of people who maybe just don't have space in their house, community work hubs might be a good way forward. So I live in the village of Comrie, 2,500 people here. Most of us commute, or did commute, pre-COVID-19. Wouldn't it be great to have a community hub somewhere within a village like this? It would mean that we could do more of that sort of blended learning, blended working, or more work from home or within our village, and less commuting. But it's going back to what I think we've consistently been saying. It's making sure we take everyone with us in these budget decisions and don't inadvertently exacerbate inequalities, add fuel to climate change, or create conditions that counter against public health and well-being.
Alistair. Thank you. Finally, Convener, to pick up on the point that Ian Finlay made earlier on about the benefits, perhaps of more fiscal powers in certain areas, would it be fair to say that, given what we've talked about prioritising helping the poorest first, that those powers could be used to do just that? For Mr. Finlay?
Yes, I think that they could. I think if we start on the premise of the National Performance Framework and what we're trying to deliver overall in terms of outcomes, if through that process we establish that there are barriers relating to fiscal measures, then yes, that is what we need to focus on. And if there are fiscal levers we can use to enhance the health and well-being of the nation, then I think definitely that is something that we want to incorporate within the Scottish budget.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. I've had nobody else indicate in the chat bar they'd like to ask any further questions. So can I therefore thank you, Jennifer, Judith and Ian, for your evidence today. We're grateful for you giving us so much of your time. The Cabinet Secretary for Finance will be in front of the committee next week. We'll have obviously an opportunity to discuss the issues raised today and earlier during that session next week. Now, with no further items on the agenda today, I now close this meeting, and I would ask members to log into our MS Teams meeting in order to discuss our work programme in private. And we'll start again in about 3 minutes. Thank you very much.